The US dollar is supposed to be the strongest currency on earth. Every financial textbook says so. Every Wall Street analyst repeats it. Every American politician campaigns on it. But what if I told you the dollar has been carrying a fatal weakness for over 2 decades, and the only reason it survived this long is because nobody had a reason to look closely enough? Well, now they're looking. And what they found is sending shockwaves through every central bank, every sovereign wealth fund, and every finance ministry from Beijing to Brasilia. So what changed? What made the world suddenly stop and examine the foundation underneath the most powerful currency in human history? That's exactly what I'm going to break down for you today. And I'm going to show you 3 hidden fractures inside the dollar system that mainstream financial media either doesn't understand or refuses to talk about. These aren't theoretical risks. These are measurable, documented structural weaknesses with hard data behind each one. And the global reaction to their exposure is already underway. Let's start with the first fracture. I call it the liquidity illusion. Most people think the dollar is strong because it's everywhere. It dominates 88% of all foreign exchange transactions. It denominates 54% of global trade invoices. It underpins 59.2% of worldwide foreign exchange reserves. Those numbers sound unshakable, right? Here's what mainstream analysis gets wrong. Ubiquity is not the same as strength. In fact, the dollar's omnipresence is precisely what created its hidden vulnerability. Let me explain. When you have a currency that the entire world depends on, you need to supply that currency to the entire world. And there's only one way to do that. You run deficits. Massive, persistent, compounding deficits. America doesn't run trade deficits because it's bad at manufacturing or because its workers are lazy. It runs deficits because the system requires it. The world needs dollars, and the only way to get dollars into foreign hands is for America to spend more than it earns. This is what economists call the Triffin dilemma, named after Robert Triffin, who identified it back in 1960. And here's what nobody tells you. The dilemma hasn't been solved. It's been ignored for 65 years. The numbers tell the story. America's cumulative trade deficit since 2000 exceeds $14.7 trillion. That's not a typo. $14.7 trillion in net wealth transferred overseas to keep the global dollar system functioning. In 2024 alone, the U.S. trade deficit hit $918.4 billion. Every single one of those dollars went abroad, fueling foreign economies while hollowing out American industrial capacity. When I spoke with a former Federal Reserve regional president at a private conference last year, he said something that stopped the room cold. He said, we've been exporting our currency and importing our own decline, and we called it leadership. That's the liquidity illusion. The dollar looks dominant because it's everywhere, but it's everywhere because America has been bleeding wealth to maintain the system. And here's what matters. This was sustainable when America had no competitors, when the dollar was the only game in town. But the moment credible alternatives emerged, the bleeding didn't just continue, it accelerated. In 2024, the U.S. current account deficit widened to $1.13 trillion. That's 3.9% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office projects it will exceed 4.5% of GDP by 2028. These aren't numbers that suggest strength. These are numbers that suggest a system running on momentum, not fundamentals. And the world has noticed. Foreign central bank holdings of U.S. Treasuries peaked at $7.7 trillion in 2021. By late 2024, that number had dropped to $7.1 trillion. That's a $600 billion reduction in 3 years. Not a crash, not a panic. Something worse. A quiet, deliberate, systematic withdrawal of confidence. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button because most channels won't touch this topic with this level of specificity. And that withdrawal connects directly to the second fracture, one that operates beneath the surface of every international transaction and that most Western analysts have completely failed to identify. It's the reason the dollar's weakness isn't just financial anymore. It's structural. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let me show you. So here's the second fracture, and this one cuts deeper than most people realize. I call it the Weaponization Paradox. The dollar's greatest strategic advantage was supposed to be its ability to function as a financial weapon. sanctions, asset freezes, swift disconnections. These tools gave Washington unprecedented power to punish adversaries without deploying a single soldier. Sounds like the ultimate strength, right? So how did the weapon that was supposed to guarantee dominance become the very thing accelerating its decline? Here's what happened. Between 2000 and 2024, the United States imposed financial sanctions on 42 different countries. Not just adversaries like Iran, North Korea, and Russia, but partial restrictions touched nations representing over 29% of global GDP. Think about that for a moment. Nearly a third of the world's economy has been subjected to some form of American financial coercion in just 2 decades. And every single time Washington pulled the sanctions trigger, it sent the same message to every non-aligned nation on Earth. Your dollar reserves are not really yours. Your swift access is not guaranteed. Your financial sovereignty is an illusion that exists only as long as Washington approves of your behavior. When I was in Dubai early this year, meeting with sovereign wealth fund managers from 3 different Gulf states, one of them told me something remarkably blunt. He said, "We watched what happened to Russia's $279 billion in frozen reserves. We watched Afghanistan lose $7 billion overnight. We're not anti-American. We're pro-survival. And survival means never being that vulnerable again." That single conversation captures the weaponization paradox perfectly. Every time America used the dollar as a weapon, it didn't just punish the target, it educated the audience. And the audience was the entire developing world. Here's what this looks like in practice. Let me show you the numbers that matter. In 2018, before the most aggressive sanctions era, approximately 11 countries had active bilateral currency swap agreements bypassing the dollar. By the end of 2024, that number had exploded to 47 countries with active non-dollar swap lines totaling over $862 billion equivalent. China alone has established yuan swap agreements with 41 central banks worth approximately $586 billion. Stay with me, because what comes next changes the entire picture. If you want to understand why this matters so much, just look at what happened with Russian oil after 2022. When sanctions cut Russia off from dollar-denominated energy markets, every Western analyst predicted Russia's oil revenues would collapse. Instead, Russia redirected 73% of its crude exports to China, India, and Turkey within 18 months. And here's the critical detail. Those transactions settled in yuan, rupees, dirhams, and even rubles, not dollars, not $1. Russia's oil revenue in 2024 reached $218.7 billion equivalent, not the collapse that was predicted, not even close. And every barrel sold outside the dollar system was a proof of concept for every other commodity exporting nation watching from the sidelines. Saudi Arabia saw this. The UAE saw this. Brazil saw this. Indonesia saw this. And they all started asking the same question. If the world's most sanctioned country can sell its most important commodity without dollars, why exactly do we need them? This is the part that should surprise you. The weaponization paradox isn't just changing how countries trade, it's changing how they think about reserves, savings, and national security. Before 2022, holding dollars was considered the safest possible strategy for a central bank. After 2022, holding dollars became a risk factor that every serious central bank now actively manages. A senior economist at the International Monetary Fund told me off the record at a conference in Singapore that internal discussions have shifted dramatically. She said, 5 years ago, we talked about dollar alternatives as a theoretical exercise. Today, we model them as probable scenarios with specific timelines. Here's what matters about the weaponization paradox. It's irreversible. You cannot uneducate 150 countries. You cannot unfreeze Russia's reserves and pretend it never happened. You cannot restore the perception of neutrality once you've demonstrated that the system is a weapon. The trust deficit compounds exactly like financial debt, silently, relentlessly, until one day the bill comes due, and that brings us to the third fracture, the one that connects everything. It's the fracture that determines not whether the dollar weakens, but how fast and how violently. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This third fracture isn't being imposed by foreign rivals. America is inflicting it on itself. Let me show you exactly how. The third fracture is the one that keeps me up at night, and it should worry you too. I call it the Domestic Decay Loop. Most geopolitical analysts focus on external threats to the dollar: China's rise, BRICS expansion, de-dollarization agreements. But here's the uncomfortable truth that almost nobody frames honestly. The most dangerous threat to the dollar isn't coming from Beijing or Moscow or Riyadh. It's coming from Washington itself. How is that possible? How does the issuer of the world's reserve currency become its own worst enemy? Let me show you exactly how. Because the numbers are staggering, the United States federal government currently spends $6.75 trillion annually. It collects approximately $4.92 trillion in revenue. That leaves a deficit of roughly $1.83 trillion every single year, not during a recession, not during a war, during what economists officially classify as economic expansion. America is borrowing $1.83 trillion a year during the good times. This is not about 300 billion or roughly 2 trillion. It's 1.83 trillion. Precision matters here because the scale matters. Now, here's where the domestic decay loop kicks in. That deficit gets financed by issuing treasury bonds. Those bonds carry interest. That interest compounds. And the compounding has reached a tipping point that almost nobody in mainstream media is explaining clearly. In fiscal year 2024, the U.S. government paid $879 billion in net interest on its debt. Let me put that in context. That's more than the entire federal education budget, transportation budget, veterans affairs budget, and housing budget combined. America now spends more money paying interest to bondholders than it spends on its own people's infrastructure, education, and housing. And it's getting worse. Fast. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest payments will reach $1.72 trillion annually by 2034. That single line item will consume roughly 23% of all federal revenue. Nearly a quarter of every tax dollar collected will go straight to debt servicing. Not schools, not roads, not defense, just interest. When I sat down with a fiscal policy researcher at the Brookings Institution last fall, she told me something that crystallized the entire problem. She said, "We've entered the zone where debt generates more debt automatically. The deficit isn't a policy choice anymore. It's a mathematical inevitability. That's the loop. Deficits create debt. Debt creates interest. Interest creates larger deficits. Larger deficits create more debt. And the cycle accelerates with each rotation." But here's what connects this domestic crisis to the global dollar fracture. America has always relied on foreign buyers to absorb its debt issuance. In 2012, foreign entities held approximately 34% of all outstanding U.S. treasuries. By 2024, that share had declined to 23.4%. Foreign buyers aren't just slowing down, they're stepping back at the exact moment America needs them most. Japan, the single largest foreign holder of U.S. treasuries, reduced its holdings from $1.27 trillion in January 2022 to $1.06 trillion by late 2024. That's a $210 billion reduction by America's closest financial ally in the Pacific. China's holdings dropped from $1.03 trillion to $768 billion over the same period, a $262 billion withdrawal. If you're finding this valuable, hit that subscribe button, because this is the kind of analysis that takes weeks to research and most channels simply won't do. So who's buying the debt that foreigners are abandoning? The answer reveals the deepest layer of the domestic decay loop. The Federal Reserve and domestic financial institutions are absorbing the slack. The Fed's treasury holdings peaked at $5.77 trillion during the post-pandemic period. And while the Fed has been attempting quantitative tightening, reducing its balance sheet, the pace has been painfully slow because aggressive selling would crash the bond market. This creates what one hedge fund manager I know calls the mirror trap. America needs low interest rates to afford its debt, but it needs high interest rates to attract foreign buyers. It needs a strong dollar to maintain global confidence, but it needs a weak dollar to boost exports and reduce the trade deficit. Every solution contradicts another solution. Let me show you what this actually means for the average person. When interest payments consume an ever larger share of the federal budget, something has to give. Either taxes rise dramatically, social programs get cut severely, or the Federal Reserve eventually steps in and monetizes the debt directly, which is just a technical term for printing money. And that's where all three fractures converge into something much bigger than any single economic metric. Let me pull this all together and show you where this is heading, because the global reaction to these exposed weaknesses is already reshaping the financial world order in real time. Let me pull this together, because when you see all three fractures operating simultaneously, the picture becomes undeniable. The liquidity illusion showed us that dollar dominance was never free. America paid for it with $14.7 trillion in cumulative trade deficits, hollowed out industries, and a dependency on foreign capital that grows more precarious every year. The weaponization paradox revealed that every sanction, every asset freeze, every swift disconnection didn't just punish the target. It educated the entire world that dollar dependence is a strategic vulnerability. And the domestic decay loop exposed the mathematical reality that America's fiscal trajectory is unsustainable, with interest payments alone projected to consume nearly a quarter of federal revenue within a decade. Separately, each fracture is manageable. Together, they form what I call the dollar exposure triangle, three interconnected vulnerabilities that feed each other in a self-reinforcing cycle of declining trust, rising alternatives, and accelerating fiscal deterioration. And the global reaction isn't theoretical anymore. It's measurable, it's accelerating, and it's happening across every continent simultaneously. So what comes next? Based on everything I've researched, every conversation I've had with central bankers, fund managers, and policy architects across 14 countries, I see three distinct scenarios unfolding over the next decade. Scenario 1, the controlled dilution. This is the best case outcome for America. In this scenario, Washington acknowledges the shifting landscape and negotiates from a position of remaining strength rather than waiting until that strength evaporates. The dollar gradually transitions from sole reserve currency to first among equals in a multi-currency system. The Federal Reserve coordinates with the European Central Bank, the People's Bank of China, and other major central banks to create an orderly framework for currency diversification. America's share of global reserves settles around 40 to 45%, lower than today's 57.3%, but still dominant enough to preserve significant financial influence. This scenario requires something Washington hasn't demonstrated in decades: strategic humility, the willingness to accept a smaller throne rather than risk losing the kingdom entirely. Scenario 2, the chaotic fragmentation. This is the scenario current trends point toward if nothing changes. No coordination, no grand bargain, just a slow, messy unraveling. Different regions develop competing financial ecosystems. Asia gravitates toward yuan-denominated trade settlement. The Middle East creates a hybrid system using digital currencies and gold-backed instruments. Europe hedges between the dollar and its own alternatives. Africa and South America become contested financial territories where competing systems offer incentives for adoption. In this world, transaction costs skyrocket. Currency volatility becomes a permanent feature. Global trade slows as friction between incompatible systems creates bottlenecks. The dollar doesn't collapse dramatically. It just becomes less relevant year after year, like a once dominant company slowly losing market share to hungrier competitors. By 2035, dollar reserve holdings could fall below 40% for the first time since World War II. Scenario 3, the snap event. This is the low probability, high impact outcome that every central banker privately fears but publicly dismisses. A catalyst event triggers a rapid, disorderly flight from the dollar. It could be a debt ceiling crisis that actually breaches default. It could be a geopolitical shock like a Taiwan conflict that forces countries to choose financial sides overnight. It could be a domestic political crisis so severe that institutional credibility collapses irreversibly. In this scenario, the parallel systems that China, India, Russia, and others have been quietly building suddenly absorb massive transaction volumes they weren't fully designed to handle yet. Gold spikes beyond $4,000 per ounce. Bitcoin and other decentralized assets see unprecedented institutional adoption as neutral settlement layers. The Federal Reserve is forced into emergency monetization, printing trillions to cover a government that can no longer borrow internationally at sustainable rates. Inflation surges. The American standard of living drops measurably within 12 to 18 months. A retired Treasury official I've known for over a decade told me at a dinner in Washington last month something that still echoes in my mind. He said, "The system doesn't break slowly and then fast. It holds and holds and holds. And then one Thursday afternoon, it doesn't." That captures the danger perfectly. The dollar's hidden weakness was never that it was fragile in an obvious way. It was that the illusion of invincibility prevented anyone from building shock absorbers before they were needed. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Which scenario do you believe is most likely? The controlled dilution, where America adapts gracefully, the chaotic fragmentation, where the world muddles through without coordination, or the snap event, where everything changes faster than anyone expected? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single response, and the discussions on this channel are some of the most informed anywhere on YouTube. If this breakdown helped you understand something the mainstream financial press isn't explaining clearly, do me a favor and hit subscribe. This channel exists to cut through the noise and show you the forces actually shaping our world. Not the headlines, not the talking points, the structural shifts that determine what happens to your money, your economy, and your future. Tap the notification bell so you don't miss next week's video, where I'm going to break down the one asset class that's quietly outperforming everything else during this transition, and why the smartest institutional money on the planet is pouring billions into it right now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.